Hello, and in this latest video, I'm going to talk about some of the options that you can use when playing the Advanced Fighting Fantasy Dark Dungeons board game. So the core game was originally intended to have three play modes. You've got the classic competitive game. This is player versus player. The goal is to get as much treasure as possible. Killing the dungeon boss is still useful if you can, because the boss has lots of treasure. But it is player versus player. You can steal from the other heroes. You can attack the other heroes. You can chase them. You can hinder them. So that's a very, very classic game mode. The other classic game mode, of course, is a cooperative game. So more and more games now are cooperative, where the players have to work together to defeat the dungeon boss. And this is popular, I think, because it takes away the antagonism and the conflict and so on. And actually, it can be quite nice to play a game where you're working together for a common goal. And the third core mode is solo. It's just you against the dungeon boss, and it's whether or not you can do it. Now, in the book, there are additional goals: explore X number of tiles, find X number of treasures, defeat X number of monsters, etc. And all of these three make use of a timer mechanism. You have 30 turns to defeat the boss, get more treasures than the other players, etc., etc. And at the end of that time, game ends. Now, that's quite good in a way, because it means that the game lasts an hour, hour and a quarter-ish, something like that, depending on how much bickering goes on, or discussion, or tactical considerations. But it lasts about an hour-ish. And that's great. But actually, there are other ways you can use this box, other ways you can play this game. So one that came up during the playtesting was the team option. So this is, in a way, a combination of cooperative and competitive. It's cooperative in that there is you plus your other teammates, and it's competitive in that it's your team against the other teams. So here, the team with the most treasure wins, the team with the least treasure loses. And of course, you can do this in various ways. Even just with this box, you've got 8 hero sheets in here. You could do 4 versus 4. You could do 2 versus 2 versus 2 versus 2. You could do 3 versus 3, etc. So you've got different ways of doing that. But if you then put another of these boxes with it, so you don't just buy one, you don't pledge for one on the Kickstarter, you pledge for 2. And there are a couple of double box options. You've got twice as many dungeon tiles, you've got twice as many adventure cards, you've got twice as many treasure cards. Now, having twice as many adventure cards means that although you've got 2 entry rooms and 2 boss rooms, none of the other tiles suffer from being duplicated. None of the adventure cards suffer from being duplicated, or indeed the treasure cards. It doesn't matter if you've got 2 flaming blades or 2 blocks of cheese. It still works. But then you've got 120 dungeon tiles. You can make a big dungeon. And so potentially with 16 characters in here, you could do 4 versus 4 versus 4 versus 4. Big tournament game. Now, this isn't going to get done in an hour. That's pretty certain, even with a 30-turn limit. But if you've got a nice big table and you've got a whole afternoon, games convention, games club, whatever, that I think would be great, because you've got all sorts of tactical options. Do you split up? Do you stay together? And so on. And yet there is an argument that if you're doing 4 versus 4 versus 4 versus 4, it's going to get a bit crowded. So if you've got 2 of these in 120 tiles, you've got 2 entry tiles. Put them a specific space apart so that you know that they can join up, and off you go. You've got a much bigger dungeon, but you've still got a 30-turn limit to get as much treasure as possible. And so there's various ways you can configure that team option. You've also got a sandbox option. If you've got 2 of these, or even 3 of these, or whatever, you could, as a solo game or a cooperative game, just keep going, not have a timer, and just keep going, and only try and defeat the boss when you've explored enough and when you want to go and try and defeat the boss. Now, one upshot of that is, because of the experience mechanic, in the game, when you do finally get to the boss, you are going to be a bit more powerful than you otherwise would be. Well, that's actually not a problem, because something I'll mention a little bit later can help mitigate that problem. So team and sandbox really are just expansions of the way you play the core game. But there's a couple of other options that came up during some of the playtesting from my group. One of them is the collapsing dungeon option. Now, this was really intriguing. So for the collapsing dungeon option, you place your entry tile. You then take all of your dungeon tiles and you each place one in turn until the whole dungeon is laid out. There's no boss tile in this. It's just your normal dungeon tiles, rooms, tiles, etc. Then I would place the hero of the character to my left or my right. Okay? And you'd work your way around the table, each placing someone else's hero around the edges of your created dungeon. Okay? Then the game starts. Now, there's no timer on this one, but when it gets to my turn, my first action is to remove one of the tiles from the dungeon. Now, the rule is you are not allowed to completely cut someone off. So if there is only one path from this area of the dungeon to the entry tile, you cannot, so you have to remove from the outside, and you cannot completely cut someone off unless there is no other option. So I remove one, then I move. Then the next player removes one, then they move, and so on. And it's the first person to get out that wins this game. So the amount of treasure you have is irrelevant as far as the end goal goes. But because one of the options in the adventure cards is to bribe, you actually start with some treasure. So you can try and bribe your way past monsters to escape before the dungeon collapses around your ears. Fighting is great. You get experience for fighting. On the other hand, if you end up fighting a cave troll for 4 turns, the collapsing dungeon is going to be catching you up. So that, again, doesn't need any new components, doesn't need any new expansions or card packs or anything like that. It is purely a different way of playing the core game. And in a similar way, a variant on either solo, cooperative, or competitive is the Vengeful Boss option. So normally, if you find your boss room, you go in, it's the Warlord, and the Warlord gives you an absolute drubbing in the first round. You think, whoa, 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 I'm nowhere near strong enough to beat the Warlord. I'm the wrong character. I'm the rogue or the warrior mage with no power points, whatever. I'm going to run away, and you flee. The boss stays there. That's what normally happens. With the Vengeful Boss option, the boss comes after you. And the boss can just move tiles, moves 2 tiles per turn. They don't worry about walls or locks or rockfalls or secret doors, because they know all the secret ways through their own dungeon. And so they will always work their way towards the nearest hero, whoever that is, whether it's the one who came in first or whether it's another hero. So once you find the boss and you release them, if the initial character going in dies or runs away, the boss goes on the rampage and tries to get the rest of the characters, rest of the heroes. So that also, I think, could be quite a lot of fun. And then lastly, we do have various expansions. Some of them are stretch goals as part of the Kickstarter campaign. So some of them are things like a pack of cards, and in that pack of cards are some stair options. So the stairs will come as 2 cards for each staircase, and there's going to be 6 sets of stairs. So you might have spiral stairs and a stone stairs and a wooden staircase and so on and so forth, each with their own illustration, but in pairs. So you're adventuring through the dungeon, and half of those cards, one of each pair, is in your adventure card deck. So you come across staircase. What you then do is find the corresponding card that then goes on a new tile on a separate part of the table. So those stairs interconnect. Okay. And so then any character going into either of those tiles can go up and down the staircase. Now, obviously, you may well get other stairs that come up in different places. And if you're on, say, level 2 and you find a staircase, you can choose whether it goes up or down. So you can go down to level 3, up to level 1, and so on. And there are some modifiers. Lower levels of the dungeon are a bit more dangerous in various ways. There's an option to use a different dungeon condition card for different levels. So your top level might be crumbling, your next level might be slimy, and so on. And so that, again, gives other options. There's also trapdoors. You hit a trapdoor, you have to test your luck. If you fail, you're straight through. So use a luck token, and if you fail, you're straight, or if you don't spend it, you're straight through. You're on a lower level, but you cannot get back up that way. Okay. So there's various options with things like the staircase. We're also, hopefully, from next year, planning big expansions to the game. So we would, for example, do a forest expansion. You would get new forest tiles, trees, clearings, woodland paths, pools, etc. You would get a new pack of adventure cards with forest monsters, traps, and so on. You would get some additional treasure cards, another boss. You would get a small pack of forest condition cards. You would get a couple more warrior ability cards, a couple more mage ability cards, a couple more heroes. You get the druid and the ranger with their own special abilities. And so what that would do is it would give you the option to play either in the forest with any of these heroes or the new ones, or in the dungeon with your original heroes or the new ones. And you've got more treasures and more bosses and more options. But in the forest pack will also be a special tile with a dungeon doorway on. And so you could play the forest game, go through the doorway, the dungeon doorway, and break open this original box and start laying out a dungeon. Now, that probably isn't going to work too brilliantly with a 30-turn timer. But if you're playing the sandbox type game, where you just keep going and going, you can then go through the forest and into the dungeon. Quite possibly the year after, if these sell well, we do a city expansion. So you're going through the streets of the city and you've got the watch and laws and all the other things you have to deal with in a city. And when you find the city gate, you can go out into the forest. And then you can go through the forest. And eventually you might find a dungeon doorway and go into the dungeon and explore through here. Potentially we may do a cave expansion. We may do a snow expansion, a desert expansion, a marsh expansion, etc. And by putting all these together, you can effectively form a campaign. And this, again, could be solo, cooperative, or indeed competitive. Although I'm not entirely certain something that may take sort of 6 weekends to play through or whatever is a great competitive game. But obviously that's up to you. But then what we can do is start putting in some campaign mechanics. So I mentioned earlier about, obviously it's easier the longer you play when you get to the final boss. Well, it is, but what we can then do is put an expansion mechanic in. So when you hit a threshold of 3 advances in the party, then you go up a difficulty level. Maybe you take an extra dungeon condition card. Maybe we do an extra campaign experience card, higher level card. You put it down, all monsters have +1 skill or whatever. And so there are all sorts of options, meaning that although this is just a great game to break open and play through a dungeon, it is not the limit of how you can do it. You can play it in lots of different ways. And hopefully over the years, we build up lots of expansions so that it gives you the opportunity to play this almost as an RPG or as linked dungeons or individual dungeons or an ongoing campaign or whatever. So hopefully that was useful. But I think what it does do is it gives you a few reasons then to go either for a double box option in the Kickstarter or, of course, go for a fan pledge or something like that. Because if we get to the stretch goals, you get the extra expansions that add to your gameplay anyway. Hopefully that was useful. There'll be another video coming soon.